Welcome to Generation Gap Sports, a look into the wide world of sports as seen through the colorful eyes of our gang of six. Ranging in age from 25 to 70, we love sports. We take you on a journey to sports heaven, discussing everything from the real to the nonsensical. We're family. Like in any family, when we don't all bleed the same team colors, the talk can get personal. So here we go with Sportscast 11. Uncorked, unvarnished, unrestrained, unrepentant, unseemly, and utterly unlike anything you've ever experienced before. Let's meet the family. From oldest to youngest, we've got Bob, yours truly, John, Bobby, Benny, and Nick. So let's dig in. Over the weekend was a collective sigh amongst many American soccer followers. The dream of another march to the World Cup championship for the U.S. women's team faltered. And faltered, unfortunately, in a way that appears to really have the potential to drag down the sport in the United States. When there's this much anticipation for a World Cup championship and you're the prohibitive favorite, to fall like the Americans did is tough. Now, to give the team credit, they put together an inspired defense and put some rather compelling drama on stage before their eventual demise to Sweden. However, from the standpoint of the sport growing in the United States and inspiring interest amongst a lot of young soccer fans and potential soccer players, a fall like that can have a lot of ramifications. It can take years for a sport to recover. Indeed, soccer right now is, while gaining some interest in the United States, it still languishes behind even hockey in terms of popularity. So where does it go from here? Benny, tee it up.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think, though, that at the end of the day, the U.S. women's team's World Cup performance means virtually nothing for soccer in the U.S. I think it doesn't really make a big difference. I think that we're mixing up what the actual situation is. I think what we're seeing is that women's soccer is becoming more popular globally in general. And so there's a lot more competitive teams out there. The U.S. has always been pretty proactive about promoting women's soccer as a sport, while a lot of countries have kind of lagged behind in that regard. So I think the other factor is just that, the women's team has had a lot of turnover. A lot of players have retired since the last World Cup. So there's a lot more young players. But in terms of the impact, I don't think girls across the country are going to stop playing soccer because of them not winning their third straight World Cup. I don't think that has any impact. And in terms of the men's program, the two really are not connected. Some people might think that men's and women's sports overlap in terms of, sort of the ramifications going beyond it, but they really don't. They're connected financially after recent rulings about splitting the pay between the two teams. But beyond that, there's a lot of people that will watch men's soccer that won't watch women's soccer. And I can assure you, as being a soccer player growing up in youth programs, that people really don't, especially the boys, typically do not pay much attention at all to what's going on in the women's soccer world. And so it just you kind of have this disconnect a bit. I think that if anyone who's paying attention to soccer right now, certainly people would be disappointed if they do pay attention with the women's program losing. But right now, I think the headlines that are coming across the U.S. isn't even the Women's World Cup right now. I think it's what's going on with Messi in the MLS. I think that's having a far greater impact in the news cycle, the women's program, and will continue now that the women's team has lost. I've been, for example, over the past several weeks, been looking at YouTube views, commentators like Lexi Lawless, for example, former American player who has a podcast, as well as a few other players. Hercules Gomez has a podcast, another former American player. Both of them have podcasts and have both religiously covered both women's soccer and, what's going on with the MLS, or what's going on with like American male players who are playing overseas with like Christian Pulisic and Giovanna Reina. And, when you look at the number of views these videos are getting, the men's sports are getting way more views on YouTube than what's going on in the Women's World Cup. And I think that's just because the popularity of the men's game is much different for Americans who are watching and keeping track on soccer. So I think that it will probably have a little bit of an impact in terms of how people view the women's soccer program because it was so dominant. But overall, I don't think it's going to make a big impact. I think soccer is still on the upward trajectory and only going to grow more. I think what we're really seeing is that women's soccer is becoming more popular globally, and we're getting better and better teams, which is good for the sport. So
I agree. It's good for the sport to have good competition and to have more great teams challenging worldwide for World Cup championships. That's going to be great for the sport internationally. But then you look at what happens in the United States. For the fans of the United States, like a winner, and they don't like being disappointed. So, you've got a disappointment with what happens to the women's team, and when you look at the men's team, they're generally not considered a major threat to win much of anything right now. So, to the extent that Americans like to see Americans succeed, they like to see American players in the spotlight. They'd like to see American players on the covers of boxes of Wheaties or on commercials for Coca-Cola. The fact that we don't have many of those, I think that really is a bit of a drain on the sport. Nick, what's your call?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's comparing the men's and the women's teams. I think kind of to this point, with the men's team being it's perceived as on the rise internationally, not near the I guess the pinnacle of the sport, but certainly surging. And the women's team, I guess having already arrived as being a dominant force in women's soccer. It seems like something that happens in sports. You see like the Golden State Warriors, they had a really good run, and then combination of injuries, being between different eras, contributing to a bit of a downturn. I think that's probably something that's happening at the women's team right now. You can see they've got two classes of players that are on their way in and on their way out. Combining that with a lot of injuries and all what Benny's talking about with the just the international landscape improving, these might not have been their year. And whether that contributes to the downfall of soccer in the United States, I don't think so much. I think the fact that we're having a conversation right now is a good sign that soccer's in a good place.
Now, but you look at this group we've got here in this particular podcast. A number of you guys have laced up your sneakers and kicked the ball around the yard, and that's great. It's a great sport for conditioning. But I got to say, I remember back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, well, in the 2000s, I've heard the same argument that soccer is about to take center stage when it comes to sports in the United States. And it just hasn't happened. And when you look at an event like this, where there's a lot of anticipation and hype and potential for a breakthrough for soccer amongst a lot of new fans, not existing fans, but new fans, it's got to be a bit of a drawback for the sport. What's your read, Bobby?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you have football and baseball and basketball, it's going to be difficult for soccer to jump into that top three. I mean, maybe 50, 100 years from now, when the demographics of the U.S., if they continue to kind of change, maybe you see more of a dent there. Or if, American football someday gets canned, more or less because of concussion issues and things like that, maybe you could see some sort of change. But yeah, I don't think it's ever really going to get into that upper echelon of the top three. But I don't think this really is going to be a negative impact necessarily and cause a further, downturn to soccer in the U.S. I mean, I don't think we need to overreact about this. As Benny alluded to, the rest of the world just has caught up in women's soccer. I'm not sure the NWSL, the Women's Pro League in the U.S., is the best league in the world right now for women's soccer. I think the women's soccer in Europe has started getting a lot more attention and getting a lot more top players and being able to feed money through their systems. This was also a U.S. team in transition. A lot of their, older established stars had either retired or were on their way out. And their young stars didn't have much experience in the World Cup yet. So that's why I didn't pick them to win the World Cup. I didn't think this was going to be their year. And I was right about that. Clearly, they didn't go as far as I thought they might. But I didn't think they were going to win. But I think one thing we may have to look at here is the development of soccer players in the United States and how we're taking them through the U.S. national team development program system. I think we might want to look at the coaching styles and things like that we're going through right now. We looked like not the most skilled team there, and I'm not sure we were top 5. We played the Dutch and they were schooling us. I mean, they looked much more tactically sound than the Americans did. We have a lot of athletes and we're great at developing athletes in the U.S. But as far as the technical skill goes, I think we might be lagging behind a little. And so that's something that, we're really going to have to look at going forward if we're going to want to remain competitive. But, the men's team is really, I think, on the cusp of having kind of a golden generation here. We have more young, skilled players in the men's side of things than we ever have before. So I think the next World Cup that we're hosting, the U.S. is going to be really dangerous. So ultimately, I don't think this is something to get too concerned about. I think the rest of the world is just catching up, and I think ultimately it's good for soccer. We're going to have some competitive World Cups going forward.
So, Bob, you've been watching soccer for 50 years and have a pretty good handle on what's going on. What do you see as the future of soccer over the next 3 to 5 years? Do you see a big jump in popularity, or do you see things maybe flat for a bit until the U.S. teams can ratchet it up a little bit?
I think soccer still has an upward trajectory in the United States. I tend to agree with Ben's comments that you can't read too much into this particular result, and also that there's a different track with respect to the development of the men's game and the women's game. The U.S. women have had kind of a charmed existence so far. When the U.S. built a national women's soccer team, we were among the leaders in supporting, providing infrastructure, developing, and so on that team. There was no baseline internationally in the women's game. So everybody started in the same place, and the U.S. took off pretty fast because we were able to field a lot of good athletes. And there was a lot of enthusiasm, and it became a great outlet for women's sports where the opportunities weren't so vast. The United States, I think, found itself ahead of the international community in terms of developing women's soccer. However, I think at the same time, and this refers to something Bobby was talking about, the technical side of the game, our superiority may have depended a little too much on speed, athletic ability, and a mania for aerobic fitness. I mean, we just ran other teams into the ground in some cases internationally. We couldn't do that this time because teams like the Netherlands and Sweden have started to figure out how to counter that. And that's not to let us have the ball. They would get it and hold it. The intricacy of their passing in confined spaces had us completely befuddled a good deal of the time. We did better against Sweden than against the Netherlands, but the same problem appeared. So I think Bobby nailed it with respect to the technical side of the game. And so it does look like we're going to have to make some adjustments, because having the fleetest and most aerobically fit players in the game isn't necessarily going to overcome some of that technical prowess. The men's side has had to do it the hard way. The men's team came in as essentially as novices in a sport that was small time in the United States and entering an international arena where it was the biggest thing going, and where there were 30, 40 international teams that have been where the country worships at the shrine of of soccer. And every kid grows up wanting to play and become a great soccer player. So the challenge on the men's side has been much tougher, the hill much steeper. But it does appear that the U.S. is starting to get the players, as Bobby said. It's again, the trend lines are such that the young men players are starting to have a big impact internationally, whereas we have seen the U.S. international profile on the women's side start to recede at the younger levels. In the last 5 years, at the under 17 level, at the under 23 level internationally, we haven't been winners. So the trends are a little different. What may pose the biggest problem, though, here for a little while in the aftermath of the U.S. performance in the Women's World Cup tournament is how much bad blood has been created. And this is totally on the side, but as you had all these U.S. players who were becoming, who achieved celebrity status from the women's team, and were starting to take positions in social activism and politics, and rubbed a lot of fans the wrong way when you represent the U.S., wear the uniform, and kind of ignore the national anthem, stuff like that. It's one thing to do that on your pro team, to do that as a member of the national team, where the whole point is to represent your country. That's a little bit more delicate. And there has just been a barrage online of criticism of the women's team, at least some of the U.S. women's players. And so there's going to have to be some cleanup in the next couple of years to kind of reframe things, get everybody on the same page. None of that has affected things on the men's side of the ledger. Long run, I think Bobby referred to demographics. I think that the American population is becoming more soccer friendly just by default, because the immigrant populations that are coming to the United States overwhelmingly prefer soccer. And by default, it may become America's #1 sport in 30, 50 years, whatever. And the talent pool of kids playing is big. So all of that is going to matter a great deal. One other interesting thing about soccer that not everybody notices is that the national teams, men's and women's, tend to come up not through the NCAA, but through national development teams, where players are picked and specially trained and play with the national team for years. Now, some come from college teams, but many do not. And so that's another big factor. The U.S. National Development Program creates a national strategy for how to build a team. If you're interested in the art of strategy and the intricacy of building a team, this is an interesting project. There isn't, in effect, a national security policy with respect to soccer and how to build it. So all that's interesting. I do think that Messi's arrival, a lot of enthusiasm. Messi is a great fit. He has come in and engaged. He's happy to be playing in the United States. Seems pleased with the environment and continues to meet or surpass expectations at this point. We can talk more about Messi. It's phenomenal.
Okay, it would seem to me then the feeling that I'm hearing here tonight, elsewhere, is that a lot of it's on Messi right now in terms of getting this thing ramped up. Messi's getting a lot of positive press. Certainly he's produced, which is large for the sport, and probably very necessary now that for a lot of soccer fans in the United States to really turn their attention that way, because that's where you can build on something positive. Benny, we had predictions put in pre-World Cup in terms of where things were going to wind up. World Cup has not been completed, but I hear some of us may have been eliminated from the competition. Can you give us an update?
Yeah, so it's been kind of an unfortunate turn of events for some of us here. Me and John specifically, we had USA over Germany in the Women's World Cup, which is a little bit off. Germany did not make it past the group stage, and Team USA got eliminated after the group stage. So we're toast, and we apparently are going to be punished. The rumor has it that we will have to do some sort of commentating on a women's soccer game. So have to break out a British accent for that one. Let's see. Bobby is doing the best right now because he's the only one with who still has what he predicted to be the winner of the World Cup still around. Bobby picked Spain over USA. However, Spain takes an early elimination and France or England do very well, then potentially my dad, Charlie, and Nick could potentially take over and win it. So we'll see how it goes from here. All we know is that you and I, John, are screwed. So
Okay. Well, if you're screwed, just gotta look to the future and find a way to unscrew it. Okay. Now I know one of the topics we want to talk about soon, and I'm gonna maybe suggest we move on from hazing and get to college football and put hazing on a future discussion. So I think we got some interesting things to talk about on the college football front. First of all, we want to get into predictions in terms of who was going to win the various conference championships, but also maybe a short discussion on just what's going on with conference realignment and what that means to us as fans and to the future of that sport. So, Bobby, you got your list of Power Fives, and who are your winners?
All right, so we doing just the winners or like the winners of the title games and the finalists too?
You can do the who will represent that particular conference as the champion, and I would say that would mean we would count conference championship games as a tiebreaker.
Got it. So yeah, I don't think we're really at the point yet where we have much parity in college football, at least not as much as I would like. I'm hopeful that the NIL transfer portal and all that will help facilitate that, as well as the expansion of the playoff. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm hopeful we're trending in that direction. But with that in mind, I think SEC, it's hard to pick anything other than Georgia and Alabama. I mean, maybe LSU could sneak in there, but I have Georgia over Alabama in the SEC title game. Georgia's just been absolutely ferocious the last few years. Obviously, title game last year, they annihilated TCU. In the Big Ten, I think things get a little bit more interesting. I have Ohio State winning, but I have Minnesota representing the West for the first time. This is really going to be our last chance to do it before the expansion next year, where who knows what they're going to do. But I think the West is wide open. Minnesota's a real talented young quarterback and a real good returning defense. We should have been there last year, and we've had a couple chances to get in there. We just haven't gotten it done. So I think this is our last real chance to do it before we're having to compete with everybody. So I got Ohio State over Minnesota in the Big Ten. Pac-12, which is soon to be the Pac-4 or nothing. But for this season, at least, it still exists. I have USC over Oregon in the Pac-12 title game. USC really has seemed to be kind of making a comeback. In the ACC rather, I have Clemson over Florida State. Clemson has been the favorite pretty much every year, generally. I think they kind of bounced back a little bit this year after a bit of a down year. And Florida State, I think they're improving. And then in the Big 12, I like what Kansas State's been doing. They won the Big 12 title last year. I think they do it again, this time over Oklahoma. Oklahoma, this will be their last year in the Big 12. And I think K-State, who has owned Oklahoma over the years, gives them a nice farewell present in the Big 12 title game this season.
All right. Bobby's put his cards out on the table. Nick, let's see your cards.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of the last go around for a lot of these matchups. Well, kind of. It's like I think about the Big Ten West as a bit of a free ticket to the Big Ten championship game for Wisconsin many years. Like Bobby's saying, Minnesota has a chance coming out of the Big Ten West. A year from now might not be the case anymore. I don't really know what that path looks like. With that said, I do see a bit of return to form in the final year of college football as we know it. So I've got Ohio State over Wisconsin, Big Ten. SEC, I'm going to pick Alabama over Georgia. I know it seems like Georgia's kind of got its footing on, I guess, the top rung of college football. But I think Alabama will take that spot this year. Big 12, got Oklahoma over Texas. Pac-12, it's the final year as that exists. I don't know what it'll turn into after this year. See Oregon over Utah. And then the ACC, like Bobby, I'm picking Clemson over Florida State. So relatively traditional picks for the last traditional year of college football.
Okay. Bob, Ivy League, it's not Power 5. I know there's a lot of interest in that. I see you got your Dartmouth shirt on, so maybe there's something behind that tonight. But if you look at the big time college football, the power conferences, how do you see it?
Yeah, the media picked Dartmouth to finish, I think, 5th in the Ivy League this week, so there's not much to say there. Yale was considered the prohibitive favorite. As for the Power 5 conferences, mine reads a lot like Bobby's with a couple of nuances. I see the Big Ten coming down to Michigan and Minnesota, so I went to Michigan instead of Ohio State. I see Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin as equally capable of winning the West, more or less. It could be that in round robin play they all go 1-1. The thing that I looked at the end was the Badgers will play Minnesota in Minneapolis, and so I give Minnesota a 1-point edge based on that fact. Not that it's particularly important, but you got to go with somebody here, and Minnesota's probably due. The Southeast Conference, I've got Georgia over Alabama. That also could go the other way. These programs are so deep that you really don't fully appreciate, who's coming up from the second echelon to take starting jobs, and they may turn out to be better than the guys who were there before because they're so talent rich. So that's also kind of a toss up. But I can't picture Nick Saban allowing Alabama to be out of the top rung for too long. Pac-12, I think, given the quarterback situation and a recent surge, USC is probably in the driver's seat. Although, given the dissolution of the Pac-10, that may affect the atmospherics, maybe the psychology a little bit. We'll see. Will teams still regard winning the conference as an important matter? If you're in a moribund league. Atlantic Coast Conference, it's Clemson or Florida State. I'll go with Clemson. I think they're about due to reassert themselves. Big 12, my instincts are like Bobby's. I picked Kansas State. There's no way on paper Kansas State should win the Big 12, but they almost always overperform. And Texas and Oklahoma are on their way out. So they may lose a little interest. In addition, other Big 12 teams will want to get the door closed behind them, and every one of them will want to beat Texas and Oklahoma when given the shot. So that's how I see things.
Benny, it's interesting. So far, none of our other panelists here have given Deion Sanders in Colorado much of a shot in the Big 12. What are you thinking about in terms of your picks?
Yeah, I must say I probably wouldn't give Deion much of a shot either at this point, but maybe in the future we'll see how that program develops. For me, in terms of the SEC, I have my grandfather's alma mater, LSU, over Georgia, so go Tigers there. For Pac-12, I have Oregon over USC. Big 12, I'm gonna go with this is gonna shock some people, but given my history, I'm probably gonna be correct. Kansas over Kansas State, and a great rivalry game. So to all those Wildcats out there, watch out. And then for Big Ten, I have Ohio State over Wisconsin. ACC, I have Clemson over Florida State. So probably got a perfect prediction set here. So if you're betting, probably want to follow that.
Okay. As I look at these conferences, so much is going to come down to really good quarterback play. In some cases, some of these schools have brought in transfer quarterbacks. We don't count Notre Dame in this, but they're bringing in Sam Hartman, which makes them more interesting in terms of a potential playoff team. But if we get down to the conferences and the rivalries, in the SEC, it's going to come down to who's got a better quarterback, Georgia or Alabama. They're both making changes there. Both teams are loaded. Georgia appears to be maybe the more athletic of the two, but I think Alabama and Nick Saban are due to flip that one. Big Ten, boy, nobody's going with Michigan yet, but I'm looking at a Michigan with Wisconsin matchup. Michigan, Ohio State go toe-to-toe. It just seems right now Michigan's got a psychological edge over the Buckeyes. When it comes to the Big Ten West, really, Bob mentioned with Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota could all trade places with that, but you got to throw Illinois into that mix too. Illinois playing well under former Wisconsin coach Brett Bielema, so they bring some power in the equation as well. But in the end here, I got to go with sort of Magic and Madison with Luke Fickell. You've got maybe not the hottest coach in college football, certainly one of the hottest. And there's a lot of energy in Wisconsin. The tricky part will be with Wisconsin with a transfer quarterback coming in, Tanner Mordecai out of SMU, who lit up his conference with yardage and touchdown passes last couple of seasons. He reproduced all that magic in Madison, which is not known for fast-paced, high-octane passing offenses, but they're going to have one now. So we'll see where that one goes. But to me, it's probably too early for Wisconsin to actually win it all in the Big Ten. But I think they can get there and give Michigan at least a game before probably losing to the Wolverines. Pac-12, Oregon is good, but USC has the potential to be great. And Caleb Williams may be the best quarterback in college football. They've got explosive athletes all over that roster. I just can't see anybody topping USC at the end. ACC, we hear a lot about Florida State. Maybe it's their year. Clemson has been not quite the Clemson of the recent past. The last 2 years, Clemson struggled a little bit, but they're still good. And Dabo Swinney is still a great coach. So I'm going with Clemson over FSU in the ACC. And finally, the Big 12. You guys raised a lot of great issues here with the Big 12. I think on paper, Oklahoma and Texas, those are the teams that really have the most talent. But certainly there are a lot of other motivated teams in that conference that would like to punch those guys in the nose one last time before they skip out to the SEC. So I'm going to go with Texas here, playing Oklahoma, which is going to make a lot of people unhappy, but I'd go with Texas in this one. And I think Kansas State, they're going to play some motivated football, but they just don't have the horses to keep up with the Stallions in Oklahoma and Texas. So I think that's where we're going to be sitting right now. But when we after talk about college football, I think we want to talk a little bit more about conference realignment here in a moment. But whenever you enjoy a college football game, it's always good to have a good drink. All right, so mine tonight, wonderful stuff. This is Chardonnay from, believe it or not, the J Winery. This stuff is something you can buy at your local grocery store. It's not overpriced, but it is a delicious drink, one you can all enjoy when you sip to your championship favorite. Okay, Bobby, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, tonight I am going with a classic. If I can get it here. The virtual background is making it difficult. Coca-Cola Classic. I've never been a fan of the Diet Coke or the Coke Zero, or the chili or the Cherry Coke or the Vanilla Coke or whatever new Coke Platinum Rewards Plus they're coming out with. It's all about the original taste of Coca-Cola Classic. Get some caffeine. So that's what I'm going with this evening.
All right, that caffeine would probably keep me awake all night. But I'm old. Your dad's really old. Bob, what are you drinking tonight?
I've got a snappy little French Beaujolais. George's Dubsuf. Yeah, product of France. Tastes fine. Working for me. And it's got the year stamped right on the bottle, so there's no confusion. 2021.
Bob, those French wines are good for about 20 years. Sometimes French wines are good after about maybe 10 years. That's where they really start to taste good. But
yeah,
I know you like one that's a little less ripe. But hey, enjoy that. Actually, that is Beaujolais are great with barbecue. So keep that.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
There you go. Okay, Benny, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, in accordance to my punishment, I am drinking Guinness, which I will say I'm not a fan of. It's not very carbonated, which I just realized because I don't drink Guinness. And it just kind of tastes like you're almost kind of drinking coffee with a little bit of alcohol in it. And it's cold, and I don't know. It's just not very good. But I will say, though, I'm here, and I am drinking it, unlike my dear Uncle Charlie, who, in classic fashion, has run off scared. Hiding behind his wife, taking him to some type of like Taylor Swift concert or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, Charlie, he's a special one, and instead of facing me like a man, he's decided to run off, hiding behind his wife, which is of course. But anyway, I'm here and I'm drinking Guinness, and yeah, so.
Wendy likes music, and I'm sure she would love to see Taylor Swift. I don't think Charlie would ever fork out the cash necessary to buy a ticket to see Taylor Swift.
That's unfortunate.
Just to put it out there.
Cheap and afraid.
Nick, you know that the chemistry between Charlie and Wendy, your parents, better than the rest of us. And maybe you've got a handle where that concert is tonight, but gosh, man, what are you drinking?
Well, I don't know where the concert is tonight, actually. Might want to figure that out. But also going with a less carbonated drink. This is a milkshake, courtesy of Target ice cream. I've added a little bit of Kahlua coffee liqueur. So we got some mint chocolate chip ice cream and some coffee liqueur. It's not great, honestly. You guys be into this, but I have not loved it. But we're gonna try new things.
You know what? Did you blend that together?
I did a hand. What do you call it? Like a
spoon?
Yeah.
Okay, because you've almost got a grasshopper with that combination, which is actually a really good summer drink.
You know what? It probably is for some people, but I decided this isn't for me.
It's not cutting it for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's resort to some wisdom from your uncle in Kansas. Talk a little bit maybe about college football. Maybe broach the topic here of conference realignment. Bob, a lot of these schools are saying that they're making these changes out of necessity. Seems like it's really driven by TV money. Unfortunately, once a couple schools go down that line of reasoning that they want the money, so they go to the bigger conferences or the conferences with better TV contracts, it kind of forces the hand of the other schools. So I kind of look at this with a little bit of regret that this is happening. I'm glad the Big Ten, is strong enough to maintain a conference, and I'm glad if they had to pick up new teams that the ones they've got are very reputable powerhouse schools. But at the end of the day, I really kind of regret that this is happening. How do you see it?
I'm not crazy about this development either. Been watching football practically my entire life and enjoyed it, and certainly enjoy the tradition. If I tune into a random football game on Saturday afternoon, it's the history and tradition of that matchup that will entice me to continue watching, to know that there's some chemistry between these institutions, maybe a little antagonism behind the fans, a sense of rivalry or whatnot. If it's just another random game on the schedule, it doesn't carry much weight for me. And the conferences are being distorted out of recognition, if not eliminated, as in as it appears currently maybe the fate of the Pac-12. So it got me reflecting. What sort of keeps the conference together? In the case of the Ivy League, it's necessity. They have there are no big bucks flowing their way that can affect things, and they know that if they broke up the conference, it would mean instant irrelevance. The other conferences seem to feel that they can pull this off. Now, the Big Ten is probably our best case study, because they've added teams before and they reached out to the East. They brought in Penn State and Maryland and Rutgers to get an East Coast profile. Now they'll truly be a coast-to-coast conference. I think if any conference is capable of maintaining its identity through this, it's the Big Ten, in part because at least there's a historic relationship with the Pac-12 teams via the Rose Bowl. So you can find a way somehow, perhaps, to sustain that magic. But what's, I think, most disconcerting about the current trends is nobody knows if whether or not it'll stop here. We could boil down to two mega conferences before long. Money has driven this thing for a great many years. Since the first television contracts, and we saw the NCAA in the early 1980s, start to separate the big money programs from the other programs. When they established what were essentially market-based, revenue-based criteria for being in the top division. 1AA was created so that they didn't have to have schools like the Ivy League voting on important issues that affected the big scholarship schools. I mean, those were largely revenue-driven decisions. So this thing hasn't got a natural conclusion yet. It's not evident where this is headed. The Big 12 has come out looking pretty good, at least temporarily. It looks like it may be adding several Pac-12 teams. And we hear today that Stanford and Cal Berkeley may find a home in the ACC, of all places. But the tectonics of this don't make me feel very secure that this is the way things are going to look. The other problem is that the more the power schools start to consolidate into a tighter group, the more some of those power schools gradually become non-power schools. I think if you look at, for example, the case of Missouri in the Southeast Conference, when they went in, they played in the championship game their first year after they left the Big 12. They haven't made a ripple in Southeast Conference football or basketball, really, since then. And I think they are doomed to perpetual mediocrity in the Southeast Conference. They simply don't have the wherewithal to compete with the big folks. And I think a lot of teams, a lot of schools that are doing pretty well or have been doing pretty well are going to find themselves in a very difficult position. It's going to be harder to win.
Good point. Bobby, the Big Ten is obviously it's going to be a pretty big conference. And when it gets that big, sometimes you have the haves and the have-nots. There seems to be a line of reasoning that's popping up amongst a number of sports writers and fans that you better be well positioned in the Big Ten to really make much noise in the future. They're really, and they really single out sort of a lot of the Big Ten West teams in terms of either being on the cusp of going forward or really taking a step back. There seems to be a feeling that because Wisconsin had the good fortune of bringing on Luke Fickell and what he's bringing to Madison, Wisconsin might be better positioned to actually compete well in the Big Ten, maybe not win it, but at least compete well. Whereas schools like Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois are in danger of falling down into a second tier, where it would really be difficult for those teams to move forward. You know, you're certainly a big Gophers fan, Bobby. What's your gut telling you?
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about Minnesota specifically necessarily. I mean, we haven't made that big leap to really be a Big Ten contender yet. And it's certainly going to become more difficult in the next couple of years, like it will with everyone. But I'm not sure we'll necessarily go down. I think we'll largely stay in the same area we are, and every once in a while, have kind of a Cinderella season where we have a chance, to get to the title game, something like that. I don't really see us being a every year a contender. I'm not sure that's in the cards for Minnesota, but I don't see us becoming a doormat, at least under the current coaching staff and everything. I'm certainly not a Wisconsin fan, but I don't necessarily buy into the hype of Luke Fickell yet. Maybe it's because I'm not there. I don't know. Part of me thinks, is he just another Paul Chryst? I feel like there was some hype around him when he was brought in. So we'll see where all that goes. But yeah, I mean, Oregon and USC and UCLA and Washington all joining will be interesting to see what kind of impact they have. I think USC will have a pretty good shot of being in that upper tier pretty regularly, and possibly Oregon too. Washington, I think, will be an every once in a while school, whereas I'm not sure UCLA is going to add a whole lot. But yeah, it's with this whole conference realignment thing in general. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of it myself either. I'm real big on tradition, and we're certainly going to lose some of that. I mean, if schools are smart, they're going to try to maintain these rivalries as much as they can. Kansas and Missouri recently started playing each other again in basketball, and they have plans to start playing each other in football again, to renew the border war, which, they did kind of a test run. They had an exhibition game in basketball a few years ago, and it sold out. And it wasn't even a real game. So it's pretty clear that people want the rivalry games. And yeah, if you lose that, you put a lot at risk. I almost wonder if we're 20 years away from having no conferences at all, and it's just a free for all. Because we're getting pretty close to, cramming everybody together anyway at this point. But one other thing I think will be interesting here is how this impacts recruiting. I wonder if you're going to see a conference like the SEC, which is of the Power Conference, of the Power 5 conferences now, they're probably going to be the most regionalized. They haven't really branched out into the West Coast or anything. I wonder if SEC schools are going to start using this as a recruiting tactic to, young kids and their parents be like, hey, you come to the SEC, you're not gonna have to travel across the country to see your kid play. You can just, if you live in the area or in the South, you can, see the different games in this area. You don't have to go from West Coast, East Coast, and the kids don't have to be traveling across the country for all their games. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact that has. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. But yeah, we'll see how all this plays out.
Interesting perspective on recruiting, and I can see some moms and dads really kind of buying into that whole travel issue there. I guess you could counter that by saying if you go join the Big Ten, you get to see the world. so to speak. But I think it is an issue right now, the discussion of whether so much travel is really good for a student athlete. And the Big Ten is going to be probably fairly creative in terms of how they set up that travel schedule. Benny, it was just a couple months ago that seemed that people were giving up on the Big 12 as basically dead and buried. And suddenly it's the Pac-12 that's completely fallen apart. And the Big 12 seems to have put together a strategy, a little stability. What's your read?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think that everyone who's not in the SEC almost is basically a target of of the ramifications of all the craziness that's going on in college football. I think the Big 12 has kind of its historic niche, and hopefully they can maintain it given the history of the Big 12. But it's very hard and difficult to see what the future of college football is because you have such dominance from the SEC. I mean, they're much like what the Ivy League football used to be, winning championships almost every year. And it's in many ways I could almost compare it to like European soccer, where there's kind of a collective group of teams that are going to compete for the championship every year, and there's just a lack of parity across the country. And so it's fairly predictable in terms of who's going to be a contender or not. And so I think schools have to be I think as Bobby was kind of mentioning, schools have to be creative to preserve their conferences by, promoting the idea of like, hey, this historic legacy of these rivalries. And that's a way to try to keep people together. And obviously that's a lucrative thing too, because all the alumni want to go to those games. But it's very difficult because, the top talent's going to want to go to the top schools, and the top schools are rarely going to be in what remains of the Big 12. And it's going to be a very difficult task. And I think it's just get harder and harder with more money involved, because that money is going to drift towards those schools that are already kind of in power, dominating college football.
Nick, it seems that there's sort of a short-term settling in terms of what schools are going into what conference. But kind of the point of everyone here that this is kind of a sort of moving sand. It's a different future we're looking at. How do you see this all unfolding in the next 5-10 years, Nick?
I have no idea. It's the short-term, I guess, plays by these schools to move to conferences where they have bigger TV contracts, can get greater revenue as a member of that conference. I think about like the product as a whole, that being college football. These are athletes, they're younger and worse than full-time professional athletes. We're gonna go consider not full-time professional than the NFL. So we have a game that is not as good as the NFL. It's a product. And the reason it's been so prolific is because of the tradition, ties to the schools, the rivalries. If you are to kind of shake those out, I don't really know what's left. So if the short-term gain is these, getting into these conferences where they can have more lucrative TV contracts, is the value of these TV contracts going to persist over time as the product, it seems like everybody would agree, isn't as exciting when there's less tied to it? Curious how that shakes out. And then beyond football, I mean, I think football, in terms of the travel and the implications of, a Stanford being in perhaps the ACC, or, Oregon being in the Big Ten. That's just one or six or seven Saturdays. You got to move your team to another place in the country. What if it's like the Stanford basketball team and they have a Tuesday out in Piscataway, New Jersey, where Rutgers plays? What does it mean for these weekday travelers? They're traveling way more often. With a lower budget. Implications of that beyond college football seem hard to figure out. Best case scenario seems like a hassle if they don't kind of uphold the thing overall. But yeah, next 5 to 10 years, I have no idea. We'll would not be surprised. There's a lot more still to unfold.
It's interesting with Cal and Stanford eyeing the ACC. I mean, if you take away geography, I can see where it might make sense, but from the standpoint of travel and educational experience is why you go to a Cal or a Stanford, it would seem to be greatly diminished with the travel and with I'll say the lack of a competitive relationship with the other schools in your new conference. If you're Cal or Stanford, you have to set up a virtual campus on the East Coast in order to make this work, or exactly how would that happen? And I do agree. There's a risk here for college football if you lose some of these rivalries that fans really key in on, and you've got NIL and you've got transfer portal. At what point does college football start looking or feeling like a minor league to the NFL? And who cares at that point? Who wants to watch it? So I agree that there is some danger. There's some danger for the Power Five conferences and Notre Dame in terms of what happens to the future of college sports. So Bob, let's shift gears here. Usually you bring something to the table in terms of an interesting sport that no one's really paying enough attention to. What have you got this week?
Well, I figured since we're looking forward, this is a little bit forward and back. Take a look at women's field hockey in the NCAA. The number of participating programs is weighted towards the eastern half of the United States, but there's a pretty good spread. North Carolina is the defending national champion and ranked number 1. What's interesting in their case is a coaching change. Karen Shelton coached the North Carolina team for the last 42 years, and they've been, by and large, pretty successful. She was a 3-time top player in America winner in the world of field hockey in her day. And now what you're seeing is in the transition is something that harkens back to like the 1890s. The next coach is a graduate from last year's team. That is Aaron Matson, who is also 3-time National Player of the Year and is regarded by the school as having a tremendous knowledge of the game. And her reputation in field hockey will be a draw for players, is the assumption. So it's a very interesting situation. I might run down the list of top-rated programs just so that get a feel for the field hockey universe. Preseason number 2 and the loser in last year's national championship game is Northwestern, which has been a constant power for the last at least 25 years. I can remember it was about 20 years ago they beat Dartmouth in the final. Penn State's number 3, Maryland 4, Michigan 5, Virginia 6, St. Joseph's 7, Princeton 8, Syracuse 9, Iowa 10, followed by Harvard, Louisville, Albany, Wake Forest, and Connecticut. So you can see that's all in the eastern half of the United States where field hockey has a great deal more traction. But where it's played, it's a pretty popular sport, and it is one of the major avenues for women's sports in the NCAA.
All right. Thank you, Bob. All right. Last segment here tonight is we're looking at just interesting things that people are seeing out there in the world of sports. Nick, you want to kick us off?
Sure. This is kind of tangential, but I just mentioned about Stanford. But they have won, it's 26 of the last, this will be since 1994, 29 President Cups, which is the totality of national championships throughout all sports. So they are dominant, to say the least. Again, we're talking about, do you want to, if they have all these successful sports that are not football, because obviously they did not won a title in that time period, what does it mean for them? I don't know. I think that's going to be very interesting. I'm sure they're not the only school like that. But I think this goes way beyond football, and the implications of college football, I think, are easier to deal with in terms of logistics than probably any other sport. We're talking about 6 or 7 Saturdays. You got to move a team, which is a lot less than these other sports.
All right, Benny, how about you?
Well, moving it back to a sport that I know John loves so dearly, I'm going to talk a little bit about soccer some more. You know, I will say that it's been interesting times. You know, if you haven't been watching soccer much lately, you probably should. And this goes beyond just the World Cup because Messi mania is continuing to go on right now. He's been absolutely dominating so far. He's played in 4 games, has 7 goals, and most of them coming in completely ridiculous fashion, whether scoring insane free kicks from like 30, 40 yards away, or just making incredible goals by dribbling through players and making incredible passes. Been doing really, really well. So he's basically just putting on a show every game. Additionally, kind of an interesting fact about this is that he's currently the favorite to win the Ballon d'Or award, which is basically the soccer equivalent to the MVP award for the best player in the world. He's won this 7 times already. So that's a record. No other player has won that. People have said, because there was by the committee that awards this, they did a study kind of retroactively looking at how many Pele should have won in the past. And they said that Pele technically should have won 7 as well, if you're including players from South America. Historically, they've just looked at European players, people playing in Europe, even though the award's really for the world. But because the level of soccer in the Brazilian league where Pele played was considered to be lower level than the European league, they didn't count that in those days. But retroactively, they believe that Pele should have won 7. So that would make him and Messi tied. I would still say Messi's the best player in history, just given the level of competition he's playing against. The Brazilian league of the 70s and 60s, for example, is not the equivalent of the modern day Champions League in Europe, where all the best players today play. So if Messi wins this, then you could say that this is the first time in American soccer history that you've had the current best player in the world in the American Soccer League, the MLS. So that would be pretty historic and incredible to be able to have that claim to fame. So generally speaking, if you're not watching Messi play yet, you should be, because you're missing pretty historical moments in the world of soccer in the U.S.
Where on TV can you find?
So it's
Messi?
streaming on Apple TV. So if you subscribe to Apple TV, you can watch all of Messi's games with Inter Miami. So
Okay, all right. So it's on streaming. Okay, great. Good to hear that. Bobby, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm going to continue on the Messi bandwagon here a little bit. Yeah, it is really amazing what he's doing. I mean, the last game against FC Dallas, Miami was losing 4-2 in the 80th minute. Messi had a free kick that went off a defender for an own goal to make it 4-3. 4 minutes later, he scored the game-tying goal on a free kick. Then he scored the first goal of penalty kicks, and Miami ended up winning in the Leagues Cup to advance to the next round. But I would really implore anyone who has not watched him play yet to sign up for a free trial of Apple TV Plus, or if you have T-Mobile, you get it for free. But we really are seeing history. I would liken it to Wayne Gretzky's arrival to the United States when he was traded to the Los Angeles Kings. That's the potential impact I'm seeing here. He's putting up Wayne Gretzky type numbers, and it's just become must-watch TV. Like, I'm actually watching every Miami game. It's that exciting. And I never would have thought to watch a random MLS game in my life before. Never cared. I would watch Sporting KC games and that's it. But the Messi mania, it's intoxicating. So must see TV. You got to check it out. One other thing to bring up, crazy story in baseball recently around the Baltimore Orioles. Their broadcaster, Kevin Brown, a couple weeks ago was on a broadcast of the Orioles against the Rays in Tampa, and he pointed out the fact that the Orioles had struggled quite a bit over the last several years against the Rays in Tampa, and mentioned that this year obviously they're doing a lot better, and was abruptly taken off the air. That was his last game. He has not appeared since. There are kind of some rumors swirling around as to why this was the case. Sounds like it may have been kind of a thin-skinned ownership situation where they just weren't happy with him being saying anything negative. But the fact that he was taken up, I mean, he's suspended indefinitely. And maybe more will come out here, but the fact that he was taken off the air for just doing his job is absolutely ridiculous and just makes the Orioles look second class. So hopefully he'll be back soon because he's a great broadcaster, but just something I had to point out because with all the success the Orioles are having this year and as fun of a ride as it's been, real disappointing to see something like that come.
Bobby, I'm with you. It's almost like the Orioles have been, it's like a miracle this year, the way they've come back. Is here we are in August, and the Orioles are still playing so well. But, boy, something strange going on here. And then until I learn more, I'd say bring back Kevin Brown. Okay. And finally, Bob, you get the last word tonight.
Well, add on to the Kevin Brown story. The latest rumor is that he will be reappearing in Friday's broadcast. So we'll see. But needless to say, this has drawn a lot of criticism from a lot of corners and a good many people in the journalistic community, whether on television or radio, from a lot of other franchises, ESPN and so forth. They're everywhere. There has been support for Kevin Brown, and to put it charitably, puzzlement at the decision. Now, maybe there is something we still don't know, but unless the Orioles leadership is a little more forthcoming, we have to assume the facts are as they appear. It does raise an interesting question, though, and I think this is something you could probably meditate on, John, because you have been in the sports journalism world a little bit. And, I did some sports information work and I did radio back in college, did some play-by-play. What do you think is the appropriate line for the home team broadcasters in terms of how you talk about your own team?
Obviously you're journalists, so you got to call balls and strikes as they are, but you are representing the fans, and you're representing the fans' interest in what they want to see and what they want to hear about and what excites them. And of course, you want to be fair. We all know that management, ownership of pro sports teams has a lot of influence, and indeed they pay a lot of bills, so they should have some influence. But to me, that this is a situation, unless there's something we don't know about, that this was really unfair to Kevin Brown. That he should be up in the booth, he should be calling games, and Orioles fans should be enjoying the stretch run here for what has really become a very, very exciting and memorable season. So from my standpoint, you're there to support your fans, you're there to talk about the team, and you're there to create a lot of interest and fun. And so far, I haven't seen anything that Kevin Brown has done to undercut that. It's his responsibility. Okay, folks. We're Tuesday, August 8th, 2023. Had a great show. We're going to call it tonight. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.